The late war era of the Seven Cities was defined by counterculture, protests of the Great War, and defiance of the status quo. The narrative sold by the Empire of the Seven Cities was that the Great War was where the good fight was fought, and that all the young people heading overseas to fight in Europa were going to return to the imperial dream of a white picket fence, two-story home, car, and a happy marriage simply waiting for them. Decades of death, disability, permanent injury, mental scarring, families torn apart, and cultural trauma made the narratives of the imperial dream a lie in the eyes of the youth during the 2700s through the 2720s. In 2700 AUC, the draft age was permanently dropped from 18 years old to 15 years old, and families were further ruined when their young teenagers vanished into war for 5 years, and even if they physically came back, they were different people. Because of this fact, draft dodging was growing increasingly common among imperial families. There were a few ways to avoid the draft: being physically disabled, being wealthy enough to hire a replacement, or you become an essential worker. It was this last stipulation that forced many families to find work for their children and young teenagers to avoid sending them to war. An entire generation where the secondary schools were emptied to field the war efforts. An entire generation where you finished growing up on the front lines or in a work camp. Many families had to face the choice of sending their children to war, sending them to a dangerous job, or being sent to prison before being sent to the front lines as auxiliaries. Surrounded by so much death and by such cruel choices, it is of little question why so many young teenagers grew into adults that despised the Empire of the Seven Cities. It is in this backdrop that we follow the journal from a young teenager who moved from downtown River City to a farm in Autumn County. Though as fascinating as the anti-war effort from the 2700s through the 2720s is, this story is about a very different monster that was in the Empire of the Seven Cities right during that time. December 21st, 2699 AUC. For the first night of Saturnalia, I got news from my parents that they aren't letting me go back to school when Saturnalia ends. The draft ages have been lowered to 15, and they want me to avoid going to the war overseas. So instead, they are going to send me to work in Autumn County with Uncle Will and Uncle Bill. I would also have to go before January, otherwise I might get caught by the draft officers. It isn't pleasant, but it is best. At first, I thought I was immune to the draft because I don't speak much. But it turns out you don't need to speak to learn how to shoot, to learn to kill. Before Saturnalia ends, I have to join my uncles down in Autumn County. My gift from my parents for Saturnalia was a deck of cards. Times have been tough at the hospital for mom and dad. The school has closed down. They're working more hours and they're moved from non-exempt to exempt salaries, while the hours increased immensely. There wasn't a lot of money left over for things like presents or celebration. We had breakfast early on December 21st, and they had to go before 10 a.m. They were always on call, and even on Saturnalia, they were busy. So I was left alone, so I quietly cleaned and I listened to the radio until my uncles arrived. They arrived in an old car, and I was already expected to go with them. Even when I called my parents to confirm, they agreed that I was to go with my uncles immediately. So I packed my bag and took a book as I joined Uncle Bill and Uncle Will. Uncle Bill was wearing a plaid shirt and blue jeans that matched his husband's outfit. They were both the same size, but Uncle Bill was red-haired and he had a tattoo of an anchor on his left arm, while Uncle Will had dark hair and an anchor on his left arm. Apparently they had met in the Navy during the Great War. but they were injured from combat, so they bought a farm with their disability pay back when the Empire of the Seven Cities still offered payments for disabled veterans. They stopped offering it when the numbers became so vast that the Empire was paying more out to their citizens than they were collecting from taxes. While Bill drove the car from downtown to Autumn County, I felt my heart sink as we passed by the empty streets and made our way past a riverfront bridge. The Golden Tower Bridge that people often confused with the Red Iron Gate Bridge in the Sunset Republic. They both had the same architects and engineers, but Riverfront Bridge was barely a tenth of the same length as the Red Iron. Still, though, the Riverfront Bridge was the symbol of the Riverfront District, my home. Bridge I passed by over and over many times. But now it felt like I was saying goodbye to an old friend as we passed the Riverfront Bridge. We made it to the other side, to Autumn County. Immediately the air felt different. We passed by pecan orchards, cornfields, and other farms that went on for kilometers. Many of the farms seemingly larger than the riverfront district, and it felt so boring near the road. The riverfront had sidewalks, merchants everywhere, buildings crammed into every square meter. Some shops are literally just 2 meters wide, desperate to take up as much space as possible. And here in Autumn County, it was like they made up not having anything by filling up the emptiness with crops, most of which were already harvested and left fallow for the winter. "What is it you grow?" I asked Uncle Will, who wasn't driving, but he was already more talkative. He smiled as he explained. "We grow corn, beans, apples, and gourds year-round. We're one of the lucky ones in Autumn County who can grow year-round, so we're always busy," he said with a smile as I immediately had a question. "How are you able to grow year-round? I thought most crops were planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. Do you have hothouses or something like that that allows you to grow food year-round?" I asked Uncle Will, whose smile dropped. He thought for a moment before he answered. "It's just the way of the land. We follow the rules and we keep growing crops year-round. We even grow different crops at the same time since they're able to help each other." "Who needs you to help out at the farm?" I glanced down at my hands. I did help with chores around the house, and sometimes Father would teach me to fix things around the house, but otherwise I didn't use my hands for much. I was not looking forward to the physical labor of working on a farm. Uncle William, seemingly reading my mind, explained. "We need help with inventory and managing the paperwork. A lot of farm work is done physically, but a lot of it is also paperwork and inventory. We get enough help in the fields as it is, and we need someone smart helping with the papers. From what your dad tells me, you were managing a grass-cutting business before the Vigiles Urbanis shut you down." I nodded and faced the window. It wasn't that hard. Anyone could do it. You just keep track of how much things cost and how much money you could make with it, and then you learn how to either reduce costs or increase profit. And you learn how much time things take, and you figure out what takes more time than the money you're saving or the cost you're putting in. Anyone could do it. I told him only for him to chuckle. "Trust me, not everyone can do that. It'll be a valuable skill when the war is over, especially if they're going to keep skipping over education to send troops west and east. Nothing wrong with getting your hands dirty, but you can't have a functional society without people who can think clearly." I smiled at his words. My parents often said something similar with how often skilled staff are either being shipped to the front lines, or they were replaced with staff that barely knew what they were doing and practically had to improvise everything that they did to keep up. The colleges being closed meant that there have been no newly trained doctors nor nurses in a few years. There were trained medics and some surgeons, but they barely had to complete a month of training before they were assigned to the hospital. So my father and mother usually spent more time cleaning up after the medics and surgeons than they spent actively helping patients. My thoughts wandered through this and other idle paths as we continued to the farm. When we made it there, it didn't seem like that different, except for the iron lamps marking the edges of the fields and the boogeymen in the fields to scare the crows away. I have seen boogeymen before, stuffed burlap men designed to scare off crows and similar pest animals. They were popular during Feralia, especially in the schools. They could be made to look cute or scary. Oddly enough, these boogeymen didn't look like they were burlap. They looked like they were leather, and the smiles on their faces weren't cutely stitched on. They were cut open, and inside there were small white stones resembling teeth. The buttons on the eyes barely covered the sockets. I don't know why they cut sockets into the leather and then covered them with black buttons. Strange boogeymen, I said as Uncle Bill turned onto the dirt driveway leading to the farmhouse. Uncle Will turned to me and he shrugged. They came with the farm and they do a great job. We just take care of them and they take care of the farm. That being said, don't get too close to them. The leather used to make them wasn't treated too well and they still smell. There won't really be a need for you to go to the field, so for now, let's stay at the house unless you're with Uncle Bill or me, he explained. Is it dangerous on the farm? I asked him, and he stared at me like I was insane. Of course it's dangerous. We use powerful chemicals to help grow the crops. The animals, even when tamed, can be dangerous if approached incorrectly, or maybe they'll just decide they're not in the mood that day, and you're new to them, and they're new to you, so you don't know what is or isn't a dangerous behavior. Then there's the equipment itself. Designed to tear down entire fields of corn in minutes, the tractor could run over you without either of us noticing. Every piece of equipment is sharpened to perfection, and the farm is a place of work. It isn't meant to be safe, it's meant to grow food. Farmhouse is safe enough for you, but as you learn, you'll grow to enjoy the other parts of the farm. I nodded as my uncles took me inside and I found my new home. February 5th, 2700 AUC. Living on the farm has a lot of rules, and if anything, that makes things easier. I work on the books, reading over the crop yields and entering it into the big logbook, keeping track of what parts of the field yields what results. It doesn't take too long, only about an hour or two for me, and when I'm done, I'm able to read from a book borrowed from the nearby town library and listen to the radio. Apparently, it used to take Uncle Bill and Will all day to do all that math. The work isn't too hard, and I thought at first that it was Bill and Will who did all the harvesting, and while they do a lot of work, they aren't the farmhands. Most of the workers come from Mercutio prison, helots from the kingdom of Vespucci who worked the combines, threshers, and tractors, clearing entire fields of crops within the afternoon before heading back to the prison at the end of the day. They aren't allowed anywhere near the house, and even over 100 meters away, I can recognize helots in their pink uniforms with the bright orange word helot written on their backs. The pink makes them stand out, and the color works to emasculate the prisoners from the kingdom, working off their sentences to the Empress. When I asked my uncles about this, they told me this was why I had to stay in the house. While most of the helots were just people dealt a bad hand and trying to make it through the day, some of them were dangerous, were desperate enough to try and attack a child like me if they thought that doing so would help them. It wasn't the helots that made me nervous about leaving the farmhouse, though. It was the soldiers guarding them. Dressed in burgundy uniforms, they carried around long clubs and revolvers at their side, and they looked mean to everyone, even Uncle Bill and Uncle Will. They reminded me of the bullies at school. They walked tough and they acted tough, and they were willing to start a fight for any reason or no reason at all. They loved to start arguments and loved to see how the helots had to meekly accept it all. They weren't strong. True strength didn't need to be flashed like a peacock trying to find a mate. A strong person is well at ease and doesn't care about trying to start a fight. They know they're strong and they can have the chance to be kind. Someone who never chose kindness was someone who wasn't strong enough to control their lives. The auxiliaries guarding the helots were prisoners too, imperial prisoners given a chance to work off their sentence, serving the empire as soldiers. They were prisoners too, outside their duty guarding helots. They would be looked down on by free citizens and by the legionary alike. They were barely a step above the cannon fodder of the helots, but in a situation like this, where they could lord their power over those who can't fight back, that's what they did. Anything to distract themselves from the fact that they were the necessary evil of the Empire of the Seven Cities. Recognizing all of those facts would not stop the fact that they could hurt me. I was still young, so they perceived me as less than themselves, so I was a target if they ever saw me. However, they never came near the farmhouse, and I don't think they even knew that Uncle Bill and Uncle Will had a child in the farmhouse. They used portable toilets and drank the water carried by the auxiliaries, though every Wednesday my uncles brought out lemonade to both the auxiliaries and the helots, along with freshly baked cornbread. I'm pretty sure it wasn't technically allowed, however, the auxiliaries didn't not bother raising a stink. At this point, they all had at least a professional working relationship with my uncles, so they appreciated the reprieve from the monotony of the week. On the weekends, we went to town. It was indeed a very small town named Shepherd, which, oddly enough, had no graveyard in it at all. It did, however, have a hardware store. Note from the journalist, nowadays we may call this a general store, a diner, and most interestingly, an amusement, what we now call arcades, was also there as well. Unlike the rest of the town, the amusement was not run down, nor even made for a small town. Every Sunday we would go to the diner and have breakfast before we would get anything needed at the hardware store and make orders with the owner of the store, Mrs. Field, and then we would head to the library where I would return the books borrowed, and I was allowed to borrow books. Apparently the library used to be open 7 days a week, with talks about it getting it open 24 hours a day if they could get enough people. However, with the war, the only staff members was a few part-time volunteers too old to serve the war effort. So now the library was only open on Sunday for a couple of hours, but I was always eager to find a new book to read. Despite being closed most of the week, they had both the pulps and the glossies. There was enough interest that these were oftentimes the only written news and news stories that Shepherd would receive. While Uncle Bill and Uncle Will loved looking over the glossies for new things to order for the farm, new recipes to try, or the fashion drama over in Cart Kadosh, I preferred the pulps. Even their smell as they aged was wonderful. It was slightly woody and brought a smile to my face. Reading the new adventures of the Silver Shroud, the newest Charlton crime mystery, and of course the science fiction and horror from the Tales from the Charnel House. I would borrow a dozen books and I would eagerly devour them during the week. After the library was closed, we would have lunch at the same diner, served by the same waitress and the same cook, before we headed to the amusement. The amusement was a lot larger than it logically should have been for this small town. The amusement was larger than the hardware store and the library combined, and it was 3 stories tall. A movie theater on the top floor where news, movies, and even television serials could be seen in the single screen theater. There was a lot of color news, an occasional movie, and even a lot of color cartoons we would watch. It was a lot of fun to catch up on the latest Dr. Occult and Rose Psychic cartoons. The second floor was the actual penny arcade, where a centie could be exchanged for 2 rolls of 50 tokens called pennies, and the pennies could be used for the arcade games. Fortune-telling machines that gave ominous words and generic messages on cardstock. Messages like, "Follow the rules, except when the rules are dangerous," from a fortune teller with red eyes under a black hood and a mechanical recorded voice warning, "Don't trust the bogeyman." Yeah, I know that, you weird-looking Grim Reaper. I did enjoy that fortune-telling machine because I would deposit a penny, and 2 pennies would come out of the slot, but it would only do that once, and if you tried again, you would only hear from the machine, "You have your fortune for the day." Other penny arcades from the second floor included snooker, shooting booths, 20 squares, Senet, and dancing figurines. A lot of variations of Laughing Sal were slightly terrifying to look at, but they were popular a decade ago, and a lot of people would give them a penny for them to start laughing or a pre-recorded joke would play. And then there were the carnival booths like ring toss, darts, skee ball, and penny toss, where you would throw your pennies to try and cover a black spot on a wooden board. It takes a lot more pennies than you think to cover it all. The first floor was where the most interesting games were to me. They had a mechanical rifle range games where you shoot moving targets with an airsoft rifle, firing plastic pellets, and my personal favorite, Marble Board, a game where you deposit a coin and a rubber ball bounced around in the sloped machine, where you had to use 2 flippers to keep it from falling down the chute. The more you bounced it around in the game, the higher your score got, and when the game finally ended, you got to keep the rubber ball, a toy prize from losing the game. A lot better than the games that gave you no prizes at all, or the ones that forced you into unwinnable circumstances for a hope of a prize you won't ever have. After playing in the amusement for hours, we would end the day watching the news in the theater, and we would take the car back to the farm. It was actually a really fun life for myself. Far better than what was happening in school, and it was comfortable living this way for the foreseeable future. Something happened today, though, to change all of that. It's Wednesday today, and when my uncles tried to take the cornbread and lemonade out, one of the auxiliaries did not come back from the field. The helots that were with him came back saying that something at the edge of the fields took him away. The auxiliaries did not believe them and sent in a conturbanium of 8 auxiliaries into the field, while the rest of the helots waited on the bus with the last remaining auxiliary watching over them. Her hand draped over her pistol while my uncles tried to convince the auxiliaries to not go into the fields. But they went in anyways before Uncle Bill came into the house, while Uncle Will went after the auxiliaries. "We need you to help us in the field. You need to follow my directions very closely. You need to find the bogeymen. If you smell anything rotten, tell me right away and don't get too close." Uncle Bill said, and I knew it was serious. He almost never spoke, just like me, and here he was giving directions as we headed into the cornfield after the auxiliaries and Uncle Will. Even though it was February and I watched the field get harvested twice by this point, the corn grew back all and needed near constant harvest. Already I could hear the popping and groaning of the corn. It's louder at night, but as we wandered through the field, trying not to trip over the irrigation channels every meter, as we made it deeper and deeper into the corn. The first boogeyman we ran across, I don't know how it got so close. I was only a meter behind Uncle Bill, and he disappeared from sight only for a moment before I ran into the boogeyman. He was wearing the same flannel as my uncle's. The figure felt more solid than I expected, like the stake holding it down was iron instead of wood. The figure had a false beard made out of hay that was tied with plastic twine. The face underneath was made out of a very pale leather, so much paler than I knew leather could be. The nose was carved to look like a human nose. I could see darkness in the hole where something inside moved, and I noticed that the movement was all over the boogeyman, small, minuscule movements underneath the leather skin. Thousands of tiny, wiggling worms. I knew they were worms when they started to fall from the mouth and the nose. The mouth was so full of worms I couldn't see where the leather ended and where the hay inside began. Though as horrifying as the worms were, it was the eyes that unsettled me the most. The right eye was a blue button that was almost human-like in color. At least it was clearly a button, and it covered the eye socket. The other eye socket was missing a button, and I could see inside the cut leather, and there was indeed a white socket inside. No worms inside the socket, but the fact was there. That was a socket in a skull inside the leather of the boogeyman. Leather that now I recognized as being made from human skin. The boogeyman was the remnants of a human body, and it stared down at me, still struggling to move and remove itself from the iron stake. As I screamed, and Uncle Bill came back to me. He saw the way I looked at the boogeyman, who was struggling to get off the iron stake. As its arms reached for me, Uncle Bill pulled out a dark iron knife that had rust on the hilt, but the boogeyman withdrew its hands away from me, trying to get away from the iron and the rust. Uncle Bill pulled me up and faced the boogeyman, tossing red flakes at the feet of the flesh doll, while I tried to ask, "What was that?" He turned to me and he shrugged. "We don't really know. We know they're in the corn, they're hungry, and if they can, they will eat us and make more of themselves." As we walked away from the boogeyman, Uncle Bill explained more. I guess he was just as eager to get it off his chest as I was to know what it was. They'll eat corn, but they prefer human organs and tissue. Whatever the boogeyman are, actually, they will remove the skin and the bones from people, consuming everything else, and then they stuff the inside of the flesh with the worms inside their bodies. The worms move and animate the body, and the bones acting as the structure of the flesh dolls. They're almost impossible to kill. They don't need their organs, and the worms stitch the leather back together, even if it's completely burned away. The only thing that works is iron or rust. For whatever reason, the worms won't go near it. They don't burn, they don't drown, and they can't be crushed, but iron will poison them. We just don't know why. It just works. Why don't you get rid of them? I asked, and Uncle Bill sighed before he explained. The flesh dolls are what let the farm grow so much year-round. The government needs the food, and the sheriff doesn't care about who is lost. As long as the food flows, the sheriff won't do anything to us, and we aren't even considered for the draft. You help us, and you're safe too. We can spin a few losses as the cost of the crops, but if we lose the entire conserpanium, that's going to be a lot harder to spin our way. The sheriff may decide we're too much trouble, and they may arrest us and have someone else work here. We have to save them before it's too late, Uncle Bill said when we heard a loud scream. A scream that could be heard. Horn blocks noise very well, so we knew it was loud. We ran, and then we saw the lost auxiliaries. The closest auxiliary to me was a young man with a tattoo of the Imperial flag on his face, a common tattoo used by Swamp City police gangs to intimidate their victims or other gangs. Though right now he doesn't look intimidating. He looks sad and almost deflated. His hand reached out to me as he laid on the ground. One of the bogeymen crouched on his chest and fed on his legs. When Uncle Bill told me they ate the flesh underneath but left the skin and bones intact, I thought it was like a spider, drinking the internal organs as a liquid sucked through the skin. A clean process with no blood, almost romantic in nature. What I saw before me was not romantic, and it was definitely not clean. The legs were broken, the knees were snapped, and the skin was torn apart. The tissue underneath the skin was pulled apart. Bleeding chunks of it were still in the boogeyman's hands as it pulled chunk by bleeding chunk into the worm-filled maw in the boogeyman's head. The meat did not drop, but the wiggling forms dropped from the mouth, and the worms dug into the meat and swarmed over the blood, digging deeper and deeper underneath the skin, even where the body wasn't torn into. Help me, he whimpered as I saw behind the auxiliary's eyes were the worms, and a very long worm dug out from behind his left eye, covered in aqueous fluid, and the broken membrane coated the worm as it dug into his right eye, blinding him. He did not scream. He only whimpered as the worms dug into his socket and made its way up his optic nerve and into his brain. Soft moans and noises are released from his mouth as I saw his gums had wiggling worms underneath and moving through the soft tissue and digging through the cavities, and the tongue itself was only a very large worm. And I had to fight myself not to puke as I watched the auxiliary was consumed on the inside by the boogeyman's worms. Can't we help him? I asked my uncle, who only shook his head. We can't. Can we at least put him out of his misery? I asked Uncle Bill, who shook his head, and he showed me. He stabbed his knife into the skull, through the temple. The blade was left in the skull for a few seconds as it was pulled out. No blood on the blade, just a few dying worms that sizzled off the blade. And still the auxiliary moaned in pain as the worms replaced more and more of his bodies. They don't die. Not really. I think all of the boogeymen are trying to scream, but there's no lungs for them to breathe and scream. We can't burn them. We have to use iron to purify them. We can't do anything about these auxiliaries. We have to find William, Uncle Bill said, and I nodded as we continued into the corn. I don't know how Uncle Bill found his way through, but we found a small clearing around an iron lamp, and I could see Uncle Will holding his left hand in his right. His flannel shirt wrapped around his hand, and blood coated his chest. At his feet was a large flesh-colored spider coated in the worms. Uncle Bill ran to his husband, and as I joined him, I realized that the spider on the ground wasn't a spider. It was Uncle Will's left hand, coated in the worms and a bite on the palm. He must have been bitten, and he had to cut off his own hand to keep it from spreading. We need to get you to the hospital. Get you to the road and get a vanguard, Uncle Bill said as he and I helped drag Uncle Will to the road. The road could have been kilometers away, and even then there's no guarantee that anyone would be on the road. But Uncle Bill led us, and in less than a minute we made it to the edge of the cornfield where the road was, and we were at the crossroads. Come on, you know I'll pay the price. Just save him, Uncle Bill said to himself, and already I could see an ambulance pulling up. The odds of a vehicle pulling up to us was low. The odds of it being an ambulance was astronomical. And yet the ambulance pulled over, and the driver opened the back door, and my uncles went in. Follow the road home. Don't go into the corn. We will handle it when we get home. I have to get Uncle Will help, Uncle Bill told me as I nodded, and the driver, with his golden eyes, drove off with my uncles in the back seat. I looked down all the roads that made up the crossroads, seeing the farmhouse down the distance, as I walked down the road. It took a long time, but I made it home. The prison bus was gone, and when I made it to the farmhouse, the house felt empty, and I was worried about the flesh dolls in the field. As the sun started to set, I saw figures stand at the edge of the field. Unable to cross the line of the iron lamps that stood above the corn, 13 bogeymen stared me down. 4 of them wore flannel, and 9 wore the burgundy uniforms of the auxiliaries. The worms were impossible to see, but I was certain that they were there. As the sun finally set and the lamps turned on, the bogeymen retreated back into the corn out of my sight. I did not sleep that night. March 2nd, 2700 AUC. My uncles have been back from the hospital for a long time. They were gone for a couple of days. Uncle Will now has a hook hand on his left hand, and he even makes pirate jokes all the time. No one in town has asked any questions about it, and the sheriff left us alone, although my uncles did have a few quiet calls made late at night, but overall we were left alone. Although more helots were assigned to the farm, I noticed the crop yield increased over 300%, and the auxiliaries and helots were a lot more careful in the fields. And as for the price Uncle Bill was talking about, sometimes there would be an extra helot out on Wednesdays, and my uncles would go out of their way to serve cupcakes instead of cornbread. It was a small price, it seemed, but the helot that the first cake was served to was one with golden eyes that looked the same, even if the helot was a different person each time. I guess the government was just happy to have more crops, and the deaths were well worth it. I still help out my uncles, though I have learned to stop asking about the flesh dolls in the field. Not because they didn't answer my questions, but because when I talk about them, they get closer and closer. even bypassing the iron lamps. At first, they just appeared in the field at night. Then they were at the edge of the field. Then they were at the front door when I went downstairs for water, vanishing when I called for my uncles. And then they were at the windows at all hours of the day, but only when my uncles weren't there to see them. The more I spoke about them, the more I thought about them, the closer they got to me. The last time I asked about the flesh dolls, how long they'd been around, for as long as at least Uncle William's great-grandfather owned the farm, they were very close. How close? My bedroom. The same night I asked that question, I woke up late at night and in the darkness I could see a bogeyman standing at the foot of my bed. The leathery face was familiar, with the imperial flag on it. The auxiliary left behind in the field. The scar in the skull stitched over, and the worms dropped from the mouth onto my bed, wiggling and crawling across the blankets while I was frozen underneath the blanket, and I could not do anything as the worms wiggled into my mouth, slithering down my throat. It felt like cold, thick spaghetti as it squirmed down my throat and into my stomach, while I laid paralyzed by half sleep as it filled my stomach before I woke up the next morning. I thought it was a nightmare at first, but now I am no longer so certain. My stomach always feels like it's full, even when I should be hungry. I feel full. And when I do eat, I eat too much. And when I sleep, I feel something move inside me. My heart struggles to beat, and earlier today, when I grabbed the pencil, I saw something move beneath my finger. I tried talking to my uncles about it, but every time it felt like my vocal cords stopped working, like something was keeping it frozen. And today I asked my uncles if I could stay home, but it wasn't me asking them. And they left, and the presence inside me finally let me move. I grabbed an iron knife and I tried to cut it out. And where I cut at the movement, I felt pain, but my skin and tissue don't feel pain where the iron knife cuts, only where it touches one of the worms. And then there's the fact I can hear the other boogeymen in the fields. At night I can hear them sing, a mournful song of pain and growth, life and death. My uncle was wrong. They're not screaming, they're singing. They know I'm one of them. They want me to join them. It's getting harder and harder to resist them. They feel like my family. Boogeymen promise me freedom from war, from work, from death itself. I don't remember what my parents look like anymore. I can't remember what my uncles look like. Even when I look at the pictures in the frames, all I can see are boogeymen. Leather faces, button eyes, and worm-filled mouths. I don't even bleed where I'm cut. Only worms fall out of me. A worm dropped from my eye while I wrote that last sentence. It was covered in my eye fluid and the membrane, but I can still see through the empty socket. Put my finger in the socket, gently rubbing the inside of it. There's no pain. I only feel the gentle massaging touch of the worms inside. All of them whispered for me to join the others. I don't know how much of me is replaced by the worms, but the worms and I agree on this fact. There's no place for me left on this farm. I will join the others in the fields, letting the worms hollow me out, leaving me an empty doll of flesh and bone, filled by worms and used to help the corn grow. To my family, I hope that you move on. Just know that even though I'm dead, I'm not gone. I'm still out there, somewhere, bringing life to everyone. And to my uncles who are out enjoying their Sunday, don't blame yourselves. There was nothing you could do to stop me anyways. Time for me to join the other bogeymen in their absolutely beautiful music. This journal was archived in Shepherd Library. The name of the writer, or even what family they belong to, is as of yet unknown. There's too many farms in Autumn County that could be owned by a Bill or a Will. How the writer's family reacted is unknown. What happened to the farm is unknown. And what happened to the other flesh dolls is also unknown. Autumn County is full of farms, a lot of them abandoned but still growing. And some of the farms have been replaced by the bogs and swamps that border River City and Swamp City territory. What is known about the flesh dolls is the worms that fill the flesh dolls hate iron, and especially rust. Even iron filings and rust fragments will repel or even kill them. And it is believed that a lot of the farms in Autumn County have flesh dolls, especially since every farm there grows crops year-round in high yields that most other farms cannot dream of competing with. Another one of the endless mysteries of Autumn County, and another casualty of the Great War who never saw a single day on the battlefield.